I was noticing Tyler's affiliation with NBC, which reminded me that my first real job in journalism was I worked for 3 years for NBC in the Middle East. And that was in the 1970s. And in those days, NBC didn't really hire foreigners. And so I had to fake an American accent. It was John Andrews, NBC News, Beirut. And it wasn't really very convincing. People would say to me, John, are you Australian? Anyway, I'm not going to try and fake an American accent today. I'm going to speak in the tones of, hopefully, of Hugh Grant. And I'm going to talk about megatrends, and also I'm going to bring it closer to home for the, I've just come up with a book which is really The World in Conflict, and that I think is really germane for the next 5 to 10 years. But let's start with the next 30, 40 years. The future is fat. Now, I'm not going to make any aspersions that anybody in the audience, and my wife who's sitting in the audience will criticize my girth, so I'll try to hold it in a little bit. But it is true, if you look at America, every single state now, all 50 states, at least 20% of the adult population is technically obese. Now, the least obese is actually Colorado. It must be all those liberal types in Boulder. And the worst, just over a third obese, are in Arkansas. I have no comment really on the Clintons, but you know, it's the South. Now, what does this mean? It means a huge cost to healthcare. It means a huge burden on society as a whole, and potentially, I mean, we may get lots of very good medicine, so I'm not certain about this, but potentially it could mean that future generations will actually die sooner than present generations. But this is not just an American problem. It's actually worldwide. It's in my country, Britain, it's in Europe, it's increasingly in Asia. As we get more and more developed, more and more rich, we eat more meat. And the downside of that is actually we get more diabetes, more sugar, and so on. Are we going to solve this? I think we are, but it's going to take an effort. I'm an optimist on these things. Is the glass half full or half empty? I would always say half full because, Pixar made it in the end, despite everything. There will be some Steve Jobs to sort of save the planet in a way, and we should not despair. But nonetheless, this is a huge challenge for the next 30, 40 years. And so is this. Now, there may be some of you who are, as they say in quotes, climate change deniers. I'm not one of them. I think the science is pretty well settled. We do have a warming climate, and one of the reasons for that is man's own activity. That is easily the scientific consensus. And the big challenge is somehow to keep the global temperature within 2 degrees Celsius. It'll be difficult, but it's not impossible. There is hope. I mean, if, for example, you were to go to these autonomous cars, there'll be fewer cars, fewer transportation problems, fewer emissions. So Juan Enriquez was absolutely right about this. I mean, things can change, but this is an issue that we really need to concentrate on. Now, this is a rather tricky slide. You may remember that lovely quote, which is usually attributed to Auguste Comte, although there are doubts about whether he really said it or not. Anyway, let's assume he said, demography is destiny. If you look at this chart, just concentrate on the red bits. The red bits are what is going to happen in 2050. And each segment is a 5% segment of the age group. If you go up, you'll see in the 60 to 70, there are big, wide red things, much smaller of the beige color. What does that mean in terms of economics? It means that young people are increasingly going to have to support more and more old people. Now, you're obviously a very young crowd, so you are supporting your parents and so on. I think you'll be affluent enough to cope. But a lot of the world will not be. This is a real problem for our politicians and for our economists. How do we manage to keep pension systems going? How do we manage to keep healthcare systems going if more and more, as a proportion of the population, is elderly? Well, demography is destiny. What will the destiny be? If you look at this not terribly well-produced chart, all you need to concentrate on is the deep blue bit. The deep blue bit is the big section of the world which is going to increase in population. The rest of the world, most of it, is going to decrease, especially the orange and the sort of the dirty brown bit. China is going to decrease. But the big increase in population will be in Africa. That could be a great demographic dividend. You could have African, I mean, don't forget Africa is full of resources, mineral resources, but also human resources. There is a huge promise from Africa, but it's not a done deal. Now, at the moment, we have 7 billion people on this planet. By 2050, we will have around 10 billion. Can we cope? Where will all those Africans go? Will they stay in Africa? Will they move to Europe? Whatever. However, don't assume that demographic growth is inexorable and will not turn back. Actually, the population will plateau. And that is because as societies get richer, they have fewer children. Now, if you take the case of Iran, 30 years ago, the total fertility rate for an Iranian woman, that's the amount, the number of children that she's likely to have in her childbearing age, was almost 7. Now it's fewer than 2. What does that mean? It means that you're going to get an absolutely different change in society. And you're seeing this throughout the world. There are very few countries where the total fertility rate is over 2.1. Now, what is the magic of 2.1? That is the replacement rate. If we are to keep a population stable, then each woman is supposed to have 2.1 children, which will, of course, in its way be a miracle. Well, in fact, it's not going to happen that way. We are going to have a plateauing of the population, and then it's going to decline. Now, let me give one final bit for these certainties about what is coming in the world. The deluge of data. Now, this year, we are moving from the exabyte age to the zettabyte age. Now, I had no idea what this meant. I had to Google exabyte and zettabyte, and I still don't really understand it. I mean, previous speakers do because, they self-confess computer geeks and nerds. But an exabyte is 1 followed by 18 zeros. And a zettabyte is 1 followed by 21 zeros. And then there'll be a yottabyte, which is 1 followed by 24 zeros, and so on. This is a deluge of data, and it's going to be something which transforms our world in ways that we simply do not know. I mean, we can imagine the Internet of Things, we can imagine autonomous vehicles, etc., etc. But we can't imagine everything. It will be a brave new world, but I hope it'll be brave in a way that is not the sort of the Aldous Huxley version. I'm confident that somehow we will survive well. But let me bring you back now to the more immediate problems. And this is something I deal with in my new book, The World in Conflict. The day the world changed. Well, you all remember that. 9/11. Now, 9/11 was before the invasion of Afghanistan, before the Iraq War, the topping of Saddam Hussein. It was before Islamic State, of course. It was before the Arab Spring. Was it the cause of those things? Yes, in some ways. And it had antecedents. I mean, the planes came out of a blue sky, but they didn't metaphorically come out of the blue sky of history. There were reasons that that happened, and Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, had developed an enmity to the United States and to Saudi Arabia. And that is something that we are going to have to deal with. We had the Arab Spring. We are all terribly enthusiastic about it. But look at it now. If you take this particular map, you will see that of the countries that took part in the Arab Spring, that had sort of revolutionary groups, only one, and that's Tunisia, more or less is a functioning democracy. The rest are either dictatorships, or in the case of Libya, Yemen, and Syria, are basically failed states. So whoever you vote for as your next president, and I would not venture to give any expectation on my part, is going to have to deal with some very tricky problems. And the tricky problems will involve migration, one of them. Now, I threw this in because we think now of migration as being as a result of war, of Syrian conflict and so on. This actually is not a slide from the Middle East. This is a slide from off the coast of Florida. These are Haitians trying to get into the United States. Because people don't only flee war and persecution, they also flee poverty, economic despair, and bad governance, corruption. And this is going to be one of the huge problems of the 21st century. How does one deal with this? Well, Europe has a problem which is actually much worse now than America's. These are people crossing the Mediterranean from Libya. Libya, a failed state, no governance at all. Be careful what you wish for. You know, we, the Brits, the French, the Americans, toppled Gaddafi, but what did we put in place? Well, I'm not necessarily going to blame us, but the point is there is no stability, and so you get this effect. You also get people coming overland. Now, this is the human cost of war and poverty, and this is the human cost of the chaos in the Middle East. Now, the chaos and the conflict have changed, though. We used to have wars between states. The Second World War, the First World War, they were countries fighting each other. That doesn't really happen anymore. The red line is wars between states. Well, what wars? I mean, you had a brief war in 2008 between Russia and Georgia, but essentially they don't happen. You have some multilateral institutions getting involved, NATO and so on. But most wars now are civil wars and wars of insurrections, of insurgencies that cross from one frontier to another. And that is going to be a challenge to all our armed forces. And if you think of the United States has easily the most powerful armed forces in the world. But the United States is not immune to asymmetric warfare, when you have people, flying airplanes into the Twin Towers, or exploding an IED, an improvised explosive device, in Afghanistan by simply clicking on a cell phone. And this is the power of ISIS. That flag says La ilaha illallah, then underneath it says Allah Rasul Muhammad. It is actually very close to the Al-Qaeda flag. But those of you who may read Arabic will notice that actually you have exactly the same logo, the same writing on the flag of Saudi Arabia. I bring that in because if you think about Middle Eastern politics from today's perspective, what you have is a battle for regional influence between Saudi Arabia, on the one hand, a Sunni Muslim state, and Iran, on the other hand, a non-Arab, okay, remember it's Persian, it's not Arab, Shiite Muslim state. And you have Syria, you have Bashar al-Assad there on the shoulder of Khamenei, the Ayatollah, and in between you've got ISIS. Now, why is ISIS there? Actually, the message of ISIS is in some ways very similar to the message that has been promoted by Saudi Arabia. Now, I don't want to conflate the two, but I want to emphasize that there is a sort of similarity, not quite a duplication, but they merge into one. And that is why the Saudis are so worried about ISIS, because they realize that they too will be threatened as being corrupt, bad governors, etc. So it's very, very tricky. And why is it tricky for America? Because Saudi Arabia has been America's faithful ally for 50 years or more, actually 70 years. Iran, as you well know, has not been since the fall of the Shah. Now, you have the nuclear deal that was signed last year with Iran, and that has so annoyed Saudi Arabia. So your next president is going to have a very tricky diplomatic and political task ahead, which is somehow to bring a measure of reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and then so they can join forces to defeat ISIS and Islamic extremism. Well, that's the Middle East. Now, if you were in Tokyo, or in Delhi even, and certainly if you're in Beijing, the Middle East seems very, very far away. It's an American and European preoccupation. What really may matter in the long run is what happens with China. China, on a purchasing power parity basis, is now the world's biggest economy. It doesn't really make sense for a huge economy not to also be a military power as well. And you can see this now in the South China Sea with China building islands there and defying the Western alliance, basically America, to do something about it. It's a huge challenge. And of course, there is another challenge. That is the delightfully handsome figure of Kim Jong-un, and he has nuclear weapons. And so we could, I believe, mega change goes ahead to 2050. It's always possible that we won't get there. Let's hope that we really do. That's the ultimate nightmare. I don't honestly think it's going to happen, but that could be a triumph of optimism over reality. What is definitely certain, I think, is that as we move from exabytes, by the way, I found out allegedly 5 exabytes is equivalent to all the words that human beings have ever spoken. I have no idea whether that's true, but doubtless some computer geek will tell me. However, it's always possible that some kid living in Minsk in Belarus will somehow be able to play around with code and empty all your bank accounts or paralyze the banking system in the United States or destroy the water system. We really need to worry about cyber terrorism and cyber warfare. If everything goes well, let me leave you with one final thought. I said that Africa has lots of real potential, and that is true. A lot of people will argue that Africa actually should be the continent of the 21st century. But I think realistically, it's more likely to be Asia, India, and China. And that really is repeating history, because until the Industrial Revolution, starting in Britain and Europe and then moving to the States, until that, Asia accounted for half of the world's GDP. By 2050, that's going to be true again. Let me just wish you something which is the Arab proverb. Patience is the key to happiness. We all must be patient with politicians, with governments, with economists, with businessmen to somehow solve these problems. They don't get solved overnight, and they do take a lot of imagination and human genius. Unfortunately, we do have human genius. Anyway, I leave you with that. The world in conflict. There are too many conflicts. They'll always be with us because, as George Santayana said, only the dead have seen the end of war. I hope that we won't have any more wars for a long time. Have a very good afternoon and very good rest of the day. Thank you.